I made a video a couple years ago called What is a Reactionary?, examining the meaning of the word. The political meaning, not the general one, which is literally just somebody who reacts to stuff. The description of that video reads, "Revolution seems to be a privilege only afforded to the left, but the reality is, progress does not simply go in one political direction." I was on the right track, but there were still a few things I didn't understand. To begin with, the political definition of reactionary is a person or a set of views opposing political or social liberalization or reform. Or alternatively, a person who holds political views that favor a return to the status quo ante, the previous political state of society, which that person believes possessed positive characteristics absent from contemporary society. An easy joke to make uses the first definition of the word. Since that definition points toward political or social liberalization, moving away from liberalism or being somehow anti-liberal means that you're a reactionary, which makes socialists reactionary. Sock Done Left had his jimmies rustled when I trolled Twitter with this joke, but he didn't actually have a reply. But it is just a joke, not a real criticism. The more serious definition of reactionary is that second one. It's what breadtubers use to label the Nazbols, the National Bolsheviks of Russia, as simultaneously both reactionary and on the left. At least the more honest ones admit that they're on the left, just a part of the left that they don't like. The slimier ones try to pretend that the Nazbols are right-wing.
Russell Brand is a socialist, but he has conspiracy brain and his whole channel has become anti-vax stuff. Really? He's like a socialist guy? It sounds like some like weird Nazbol shit? I don't know.
By the way, the National Bolsheviks are a faction within Russia that want to see a return to the Soviet Union's political and economic systems. They're simultaneously authoritarian leftist on the political compass, and reactionary in that they favor a return to a previous status quo. I've been called reactionary quite a bit myself, most recently by this person, Natalie, on Twitter. She's doing so in a thread where I ratioed her, and it actually got under her skin a little bit. Listen, I'm not Keffels. I don't care whether or not I ratio people. I don't view my personal worth as being made up of likes on social media. But let's examine this idea that I'm a reactionary YouTuber. I'm not taking it as an insult, but I do want to consider the label. What previous state of society do I want to return to? And in that state, are there actually values found there that we're currently lacking? I think there's an easy answer to those questions. In terms of freedom of expression, we were significantly more free, at least culturally, 20 years ago than we are now. And by some very loose definition, that does make me a reactionary. But we're not simply doing the "what is a reactionary" video again. That's not the title of this video. We're talking about something that is related but different. And let me show you what inspired it. A while ago, there was a bit of drama where I made a video about the alt-right pipeline, and then Xander Hall responded to it. And then I responded to that on Admin Sitch. And then Xander Hall said he'd come on the stream, and then he didn't. And then Xander Hall ducked a future talk with me and also ducked one with Sargon, leaving Chud Logic wondering what was going on. Yeah, this whole thing was like a month ago. I was inspired to do this video back then, and I just sat on the idea. Sorry. During that Adam and Sitch stream, in Xander Hall's comment section, there was one message that briefly caught my eye, but there was no real way to talk about it in the moment. And here it is. I find it kind of funny how right-wingers always say the left used to be X, but now it's too far. Like, bro, that's the point of progressivism, that we progress. We don't just sit at one place politically. 300 years ago, totally abolishing the monarchy in favor of a liberal democracy was far left and crazy, but time moved on. As things change, and we learn and experience, and as a society, we move forward and progress. In other words, to progress means always to move leftward. In this guy's point of view, the shifting of the Overton window leftward over time is not only expected, not only required, but it is indeed a natural process of history. It's just how it is. Progressing not only means moving leftward over time, it means that it is the proper state of history to move leftward. That history itself has an animating force pushing society left. If you think I'm exaggerating here, it's not hard to find a breadtuber who will parrot this exact sentiment.
It objectively is the case. I mean, by any standard whatsoever. Historically, as you move linearly in time forward, political opinions move left. That's not an argument. Like you literally it's progress. It's just how it works. It's just how humans operate. What are you talking about? Literally, yes. It always moves left.
It's also not hard to find a breadtuber who will point out, just like that commenter, that a progressive who fails to progress with the times will eventually become a reactionary.
You motherfuckers LARP as progressives until progressivism, or the idea of challenging social norms, suddenly overlaps with a norm that you like. I fucking hate it when people like you act like that. It's so fucking frustrating. Progressivism isn't just about being pro-gay or whatever the fuck else, okay? It's about a fundamental, unconditional willingness to challenge social norms, or at the very least to be understanding of the ways in which those social norms are formed and the influences those can have socially, okay? That's progressivism. Because if you're just progressive because you're like pro-gay or pro-trans or whatever, you're going to be the next reactionary. You can't. It's not enough to just be pro whatever social shit people are for these days, okay? You need to have a general awareness of how all these like reactionary takes are beget by the normalization of social values, okay?
So, in the minds of these people, the neutral position isn't actually remaining still. Neutrality is drifting leftward slowly over time. Progressivism is actively moving leftward quickly over time. And if you do remain at a standstill, you are automatically shifting right, because it's not you that's actually moving, but the political landscape itself, shifting beneath your feet. Some might even say that people don't actually become more conservative as they age. Rather, their culture becomes more progressive over time, and their old progressive opinions become conservative ones as they get older. This is the source of those right-wing memes that show conservatives of the future arguing for progressive policies of today. And this is why I talked about being a reactionary at the start of the video, because Vosh correctly pointed out that in the minds of many progressives, there are only two camps, them and reactionaries. And the more left you are, the more progressive you are. The more right you are, the more reactionary you are. So a person who is extremely progressive is going to be viewed as a reactionary by somebody who is just even a little bit further left than them. This entire interpretation rests on the assumption that progress and reaction are two forces that always oppose, and that to make gains in one necessarily must mean that you lose in the other. But I think that we can show that this is not exactly true. So many people on the left are desperately trying to redefine the Nazbols as right-wing, or other reactionary left elements like TERFs, for example, even though they're clearly on the left, because these are groups that are simultaneously progressive and reactionary. They want a return to a previous status quo because they believe that that previous status quo represented more progress than what we're currently living in. Consider this. Whenever a right-wing candidate wins an election, or a piece of left-wing policy falls apart, normies on social media will often post Star Trek memes. Star Trek is the progressive utopia in pop fiction, and these memes are often accompanied with stuff like, "I thought we were moving forward," or "This is the future that Democrats want." They view progress as being a unidirectional path, an arrow that points at the bright, shining utopian city on the hill, where all of humanity's problems are solved, and the only possible way you could disagree with them is if you were stupid or evil. It couldn't be because they're wrong, because they want what's good. They're for progress, after all. Meanwhile, somebody like a Nazbol is much more likely to view the future like it looks in Fallout. If you were living in a post-apocalyptic, tribalistic nuclear wasteland, you would be a reasonable person to long for a return to that old civilization, that old status quo of prosperity, even if it's reactionary to do so, because the future isn't actually that good in that case. We don't even need to use these extreme, detached from reality examples either. Is it progress that in Democrat-controlled cities, we see spiking drug use and urban decay? Is it reactionary to prefer a time in the past where there was more social cohesion? In other words, progressives view the nature of progress as being something like a technology tree in a game of civilization. You level up your progress. The new thing eventually becomes outdated, and those who cling to it become reactionary in the process, and progress marches on. There's only one way to go, and that is up. But in reality, there's actually a lot wrong with this conception of progress. For example, take the classical fascists. The socialists of today use reactionary to refer to fascism, or fascist adjacent. They have no problem calling people fascists for no reason, but if their target is such that it's too much of a reach even for them, they'll say reactionary instead. I've heard people like It's a Gundam or Turkey Tom be called reactionary because they make videos laughing at dumb fucks on social media. And yeah, they're literally reacting, but that's not the point. The point is that they're laughing at the silly things people do in the name of progress, which itself is a step towards suppressing progress by making people feel embarrassed for doing things that are progressive. So if you're making fun of something that's progressive, you're reactionary. Obviously though, iconoclasts and comedians who laugh at everything, including laughing at the left, are not fascists. But progressives treat them like they are because if you're not progressing properly, you're a reactionary, and they view fascism as the natural end result of reactionary tendencies. That's why capitalism decays into fascism in their view, because progression is abandoning capitalism for socialism. Or why liberalism props up fascism, because progression is overthrowing liberalism with socialism. It's all the same logic. Either you're a progressive socialist or you're a reactionary fascist. If you claim to be neither, you automatically assist the reaction against revolution. It's very George Bush in a way.
Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
The problem with this view is that it's not true. Joseph de Maistre was the first reactionary, and the first one to really write about the philosophy of reaction. In the context of the French Revolution, de Maistre critiqued the Enlightenment as a destabilizing social force, that a monarchy ordained by God was the only form of government that had political legitimacy, and that the only way to cultivate social cohesion was through strict authority and hierarchy. His writing created the philosophical basis for modern European traditional conservatism, contrasting that with Edmund Burke's English liberal conservatism. In The Doctrine of Fascism, Mussolini writes at length about reactionaryism and de Maistre. The fascist negation of socialism, democracy, and liberalism should not, however, be interpreted as implying a desire to drive the world backwards to positions occupied prior to 1789, a year commonly referred to as that which opened the demo-liberal century. History does not travel backwards. The fascist doctrine has not taken de Maistre as its prophet. Monarchical absolutism is of the past. Dead and done are feudal privileges and the division of society into closed, uncommunicating castes. The fascist state is, however, a unique and original creation. It is not reactionary but revolutionary, for it anticipates the solution of certain universal problems which have been raised elsewhere. Fascism has outgrown the dilemma, monarchy versus republic, over which democratic regimes too long dallied, attributing all insufficiencies to the former and proning the latter as a regime of perfection, whereas experience teaches that some republics are inherently reactionary and absolutist, while some monarchies accept the most daring political and social experiments. Look at the language used in these passages. The classical fascists viewed themselves not as reactionary but revolutionary. They viewed themselves as the solution to the capitalist versus socialist problem. In Hegelian terms, they viewed themselves as the synthesis to the thesis of capitalism and the antithesis of socialism. If you're a leftist watching this video, I already know what you're saying to yourself in your head. The fascists lied about everything. They just wanted to get people on their side. But no government commonly called fascist ever actually instituted a true return to the past. Hitler did not rebuild any of the old German empires or call Kaiser Wilhelm back to the throne from exile in the Netherlands. In fact, the Nazis hated the old German institutions. Mussolini viewed Italy's Catholicism not as a part of its conservative indigenous culture to be protected, but as a barrier hindering his consolidation of power. Japan had no desire to return to a pre-Meiji Restoration feudalistic era. Spain never had any desire to return to its old imperial ways, instead transitioning towards autarky, an economic move that is characteristically un-Spanish. The behaviors of these governments may not be revolutionary in the specific ways that terminally online socialists would prefer, but they clearly weren't seeking a return to a past state of politics. This isn't just my analysis either. Utopian fascism is a topic that's been studied extensively. Utopia, in the political sense, is the end state of progress, the final goal, when all progressing has been done, when all possible improvements have been made, when every project has reached its culmination, human society achieves its perfection. And the fascists, rather than grasping for the imperfection of the past, had their own conception of utopia, separate from the leftist view of the stateless, moneyless, classless communism. The term reactionary modernism was coined by historians to try and explain this great contradiction within fascism, where they had a great admiration for the concept of progress, but they nonetheless rejected the socialist vision of it. The reason this appears to be a contradiction is because of the a priori assumption that the socialist vision of progress is the correct one. Again, it's the skill tree that only fills one way. It's the Star Trek thinking, having a vision of the future that only exists in theory inside your head, and then every move towards it is progress. Every move away from it is regress, regardless of the actual cause and effect of the moves in reality. If you already have a mental structure in your head that says feudalism to capitalism to socialism to communism, all traveling along a conveyor belt, anything that doesn't fit into that move has to instead be pushing backwards. But like I said earlier, the fascists viewed themselves, not communism, as the stage beyond socialism. Again, the socialist reply to this is to scream that the fascists are lying. The socialist says fascists lie. You cannot trust anything they say or write. They're subversive. They will do anything to gain power. Putting aside for the moment, that sounds like nearly every single socialist online right now. It's also an anti-intellectual position, to deliberately avoid an entire wing of knowledge simply because it comes from people you don't like. Dr. David Roberts, history professor at the University of Georgia, writes in his book, Fascist Interactions, that the greatest advance in fascist studies over the last 40 years has come precisely from taking the fascist self-understanding seriously. By now, it is widely held that fascism was not some revolt against modernity, but the quest for an alternative modernity. This would imply that it was not merely an effort to catch up to the modern democracies through different, more extreme means. And rather than merely counter-revolutionary or reactionary, fascism was in some sense revolutionary in its own right. Fascism may not be the type of revolutionary that your average online socialist likes, but it is revolutionary nonetheless. They viewed themselves as progressing even if you might not. This view of progress as an ongoing unidirectionary method is called Whig historiography. The Whigs were a British liberal movement before liberalism was a thing. What they were all about isn't too important right now, but they had a view of history as being a journey, where humanity travels from an oppressive, cruel past into a glorious advanced future. They believe the ultimate culmination of Whig historiography was liberal democracy and constitutional monarchy. The phrase Whig historiography was originally coined as a satirical term, but was eventually adopted by the Whigs and later the Liberals in the UK. The idea is that history has a goal that it actively moves towards, rather than simply existing. This is where you get the phrase the end of history. Socialism is built atop of the concept of Whig historiography, that history has a goal it actively moves towards, but they disagree that the end stage is liberal democracy. Marx's view, being a revision of the Whigist view, considered socialism to be the next stage after liberalism. Mussolini's view, being a revision of the Marxist view, considered fascism to be the next stage after socialism. And it doesn't stop there. For example, Alexander Dugin, stylized as Putin's philosopher, much like Gentile was Mussolini's, and the creator of the National Bolshevik ideology, wrote his own book on this topic, The Fourth Political Theory. He views his ideas as the next step beyond fascism, like Mussolini saw fascism being beyond socialism, and Marx saw socialism being beyond liberalism. His theory, the fourth theory, therefore is progress beyond those big three, at least according to him. This end of history, march of progress rhetoric is appealing to many people that the left would call reactionary, even though reactionaryism explicitly rejects the march of progress, rather than searching for alternative modes of progress like the fascists do. And this is where we come to the core of the issue. Fascists are not reactionaries. Fascists still worship the concept of progress in the same way that progressives and socialists do. They just have a different meaning of progress. Actual reactionaries reject the very concept of progress itself, and in doing so, they simultaneously reject socialism and fascism. It is this distinction between a fascist and a reactionary that I don't think anybody on the online left understands right now, and I think that's why they have a hard time quantifying right-wing politics beyond simply saying the right is bad and then getting upvotes online. Julius Evola was a philosopher in fascist Italy, and he is considered a fascist by many, but he called himself a super-fascist. What he meant by that was he considered the classical fascists as not being fascist enough for his tastes, and his writing would ultimately discard classical fascism for not being reactionary. Evola's most famous work, Revolt Against the Modern World, is explicitly anti-modern in all of its forms, liberal, socialist, and fascist. The neo-reactionary movement, otherwise known as the Dark Enlightenment, are, true to their name, explicitly reactionary. Evola is one of their bedrocks, along with anarcho-capitalists like Hoppe, and modern figures like Mencius Moldbug. Rather than seeking an alternative progress like the fascists do, rather than declaring themselves the next stage in the march of history, they reject Whig historiography altogether. They advocate not for a fascist government, but an actual return to older forms of government, like absolute monarchy or cameralism. These people aren't fascists, they're actually reactionaries. They're not futurists the way the fascists were. They reject progress as a virtue, rather than arguing over what constitutes the next stage of it. And when socialists call everyone who's not them reactionary or fascists, they just don't understand the words they're using. When people out there call It's a Gundam or Turkey Tom or myself reactionary YouTubers, they have no clue what they're talking about. We may not agree with your conception of progress, or the fascist one for that matter, but that doesn't mean that we reject progress entirely. We have our own idea of what it is. We don't want to return to a previous political paradigm a priori. We may want to see the restoration of virtues lost to the past, not because it's in the past, but because we view society as having regressed. It's the difference between looking at a past era and wanting it because it represents going back, and the concept of progress is bad, that's the reactionary view, and looking at a past era and wanting it returned because it actually represents real progress, and the path that we've gone down is fake progress. And that is where I am. I'm not a reactionary, I don't value regression, but I don't believe that what the socialists or the fascists call progressive actually contains any real progress at all. They're all just different flavors of failure, distinct from each other, but nothing I'm interested in. I mentioned the Hegelian method earlier, and that's partially because Hegel's view of history is the ultimate end of the concept of progress. Whether it's socialist or fascist or any other type of ist, Hegel's view is that the march of progress, and history automatically engaging in that march, a view called historicism, has its natural end in the authoritarian, bureaucratic state. This would later be coined as totalitarian by the fascists. But the socialists would also embrace this concept. Where Mussolini would say, all within the state, the socialists would say everything is political. It's the same concept, two sides of the same coin. A utopia in its perfection would have to be totalitarian, because perfection means perfection in all places. That's why they always say real socialism has never been tried, because it has to be everywhere, so that the imperfection of other locations cannot simply upend the construction. A utopia in its perfection would have to be bureaucratic, because if, as Mussolini said, everything is within the state, everything needs to be controlled and managed. A utopia in its perfection would have to be authoritarian, because if you've already got everything perfectly correct, there is no need to tolerate any more dissent, or debate, or people leaving and going their own way. All utopianism, regardless of political slant, is totalitarian. And all political movements that believe in the march of progress, in this historicism, that history has a teleology, is ultimately utopian. The neo-reactionaries might reject this whole process, but I think they throw the baby out with the bathwater. For all of the ills of modernity, it's brought with it a lot of good. So the question is, what's the solution to this problem? Max Weber was a German historian and economist, founder of the field that would later be known as sociology, and the inventor of the concept of methodological individualism, the idea that individual motivations explain social phenomena, and that class dynamics are ultimately just illusions. This idea was accepted by neoclassical economists, Austrian economists, I think pretty much every economic school other than the socialists, but it's not a purely economic idea. Weber's interest was in the intersection of economics and history, and he is known for saying history consists of individual relations and events, and it is not the job of those who study history to develop from it a social science or ideology to guide our way. I think my view of progress is more in line with Weber's idea. There is no end of history. There is no destiny that human society must pursue at all costs, or resist at all costs, as the reactionaries would have it. There is no utopia that we can build. History does not naturally trend leftward over time, or towards socialism or fascism or anything else. No movement in any direction, left, right, or other, can truly be considered progress or regress beyond your own personal views. A great example of what I'm talking about is this one article I came across coming out of Minnesota when preparing for the Roe v. Wade Tubcast. I want you to pay close attention to the language used by the pro-life people in this article. If the US Supreme Court were to throw out the Roe v. Wade decision, abortions would remain legal in Minnesota due to a state's Supreme Court ruling back in 1995. The ruling, known as Doe versus Gomez, guaranteed the right to abortion in Minnesota and required the state to cover the cost for low-income patients. In order for us to move forward here in Minnesota, we do have to get rid of Doe versus Gomez. Getting rid of Roe versus Wade and then Doe versus Gomez are going to be big steps in the right direction for us to ultimately restore protection for unborn children in Minnesota, where, through most of our history, the unborn were protected. Even though the pro-life guy appeals to history, he also uses progressive terminology. And I don't mean progressive in terms of the political group, but in terms of appealing to progress. He says phrases like moving forward and steps in the right direction, because ultimately, everybody views themselves as progressing towards whatever they want. That's what progression is. If you want food from your fridge and then you walk over and get it, the act of walking is progressing towards that goal. The word progress simply means what you desire. And to make progressivism into a political school simply attaches a moral framework that centers your desire as an a priori good. By calling somebody regressive or reactionary for not agreeing with your desires, or by worshipping your own theorized end state as a utopian progressive vision, all you're doing is exerting control over other people. That is what is at the bottom of all progressive views. Progressives are good because they have the desire they have, everyone else is bad, and that's that. I just can't get behind any of this, though. I don't believe in the reactionary idea that the past was entirely better all the time. We should implement any of the old systems. But I also don't believe that progress moves in any one direction, regardless of what direction that is. And that people who don't want what I want are just evil. I don't believe that any sort of utopia can actually exist at all. I think if I had to call progress something, I would say that it moves in all directions simultaneously. It radiates outward like ripples on a pond. Progress is simply the next thing you do, and everyone's got a different next thing. So a concept of political progress, a concept of progress beyond your own personal goals just seems useless. In other words, if you're conceptualizing progress, you should only do so on an individual level. It's progress if you want to lose weight and then you lose 10 pounds. If your conception of progress is political, if it involves colonizing the minds of others and forcing people to engage with your narrowly defined ideas of not only how your life should be run, but how the whole world should be run, then I think you are automatically a tyrant. That's why all of these socialists and anarchists on the left are, to me, no different than fascists in the end. And frankly, same with the reactionaries too. Not because they have the same ideas, obviously they don't, but because they all have an anti-individual, hyper-dogmatic view of the world. They all think that they are the ones who know what a universal, perfect conception of progress is, and they will absolutely destroy everything in their pursuit of it. But for me, not everything is political. The personal isn't political. There are things outside the bounds of the state. And ultimately, progress is personal, not political. In this way, the policies of government can't be framed as progress or regress, as revolutionary or reactionary. And any such framing simply appears to be a power grab that relies on this idea of the end of history, that there can be a utopian perfection. It's no surprise to me that every single time we've chased it, millions of people have died.